Mongoose, and we added some new functionality to our app, and that we can now interact with our database. But let's take a quick look at our server file. Close that. Close our index.ejs. Okay, so here we've got kind of a bunch of stuff going on in our server. We made our Mongo connection, and then we actually established our Dojo schema, and then we registered our model, and we came down here, and we got a reference back to our model, and then we did our routes. So we're kind of doing everything in one file. Now that works fine for something really small like this because we don't have a lot of routes, we don't have a lot of models. However, what happens when we start adding a bunch of different models to our project? Or a bunch of different, excuse me, or a bunch of different routes. Yeah, it's going to get really crowded in the server.js, and it's going to be kind of a pain in the butt to look through it to find the things that we're interested in. So what we want to start doing here is breaking this out into different files and different directories, so we have kind of a nice organized structure for our project, and we know where to look for different things. So let's take a quick look on the platform here of the structure that they're recommending. And this is it. Let me see if I can make it a little bigger here. Okay, so basically in this way of organizing things, and this is not the only way, it is a way, we would have a folder for all of the client-side things that we're going to be doing. So we may have a static folder if we're going to have some CSS files or some images, something like that. And then we'll have another views subfolder, which would have all of our EJS files. Node modules, of course, which is always there. We're not really doing anything with that. And then inside of our server directory, we're going to have a config subdirectory where we house some of our Mongoose logic. And then we're also going to have our routes inside there. And then we're also going to have a controllers folder where we'll have all of our controllers. And we'll have a models folder with all of our models. And then, of course, our server.js will still be there, but it's going to be largely thinned out. Yes, Tom?
I am sorry if I missed this. I'm interrupting you for no reason, but is your recording going?
Yeah?
Oh, okay. Sorry.
No, thanks for asking.
I'm sorry, I missed you. I must have looked away. I'm sorry.
That's okay. It's all right. Okay, so largely what's going to happen with our server.js is that it's going to get quite a bit smaller, and then we're going to push things into different locations. All right? Any questions about this? Good? All right, so let's get back to our project here, and let's start creating some of this structure. So we want to have a server folder, and then inside that server folder, we were going to have some different things. So we're going to have a config subfolder. And then we're also going to have a models folder. And then we're also going to have a controllers folder. Do you guys remember what the acronym that we were using in Python was? So as far as the modularization of it? MTV, yeah, very good. And what does that stand for?
Model templates views.
Models, templates, views, right. So here we're going to be using something more called MVC. Anyone know what that stands for?
View controller.
Models, views, and controls. Very good. Perfect. All right, so that's what we're going for here with our modularization, is to split it up like that. Okay, so let's start out by just moving some things around, right? We've got the easiest thing to probably do is to create our client folder. And then inside that, again, we might have a static folder where we've got some CSS or something like that. And then we'll also have our views folder. Oops. Okay, so actually, let me get rid of this. I'm just going to move it. So first thing, let's move our views into the client folder. Let's go like that. And then let's see if our app broke. No complaints here, but we do need to change that, right? So what do we need to change this to? Yeah, so we need to go into client and then into views, right? Good. And then if we want to kind of keep testing it along the way to make sure that we didn't throw anything off. So we're still getting our view, so everything's good there. All right. Now, what we may want to start with is how can we move out our models? So our model logic is all in here, right? Let's start by getting that out. Where do we want our model to be? Inside the models folder, right? So let's create a new file for it. So we'll just say this would be dojo.js. Okay, and then I'm just going to grab most of this here. Grab this right here. Okay, and then inside Dojo, do I have a reference to Mongoose yet? Not yet, so I'm going to have to require it. Yeah, exactly. So let's just bring it in. Mongoose require Mongoose. Okay. Very good. Are we actually requiring this file yet? Anywhere? Not yet, right? Okay. So let's we're going to have to do that at least temporarily, right? Because since we're doing this logic here, if we don't actually require it, then theoretically something should break when we. So if I just take this out completely, totally breaks things, right? Because the schema hasn't been registered for model dojo. Okay. So for now, let's just require it from where it is. So we'll say const, actually, let's just require it. So the way that we do that, since this is our own module, is we're going to say the single dot, just saying it's in the directory that we're in, and then I'm just going to go / and then the complete path to it from there. Okay, so we'll say require dot, and then I'm going to go into server, and then into models / dojo. Okay, so since we're using what's called common.js, we actually don't have to specify the final .js on that. Okay. So let's save that, and now things are working properly again, right? So if I refresh my page, all good. All right. Fair enough. Let's start working on this config folder a little bit as well, because this is where we actually want to do our Mongoose connection, our basic Mongoose logic. So let's create a Mongoose file here, and then we're also going to create a routes file here for later. So inside the Mongoose file, what I want to do, I think the platform may have this slightly different. Do they leave the connection out here in server.js?
That we've gotten so far.
Oh, yikes.
Like, it just doesn't tell you anything.
That doesn't really say anything? Okay.
They moved the connection into Mongoose.
Oh, they did? Okay. Yeah, and I was going to do that too. So I just wanted to see if I was being consistent with that or not. So let's just grab this mongoose.connect here. And we're going to drop that into Mongoose itself. Okay, but again, we don't have a reference to Mongoose, so I do need to require it here as well. Okay, now our connection logic is in there, but again, if we don't actually require this file, then what's going to happen? So if I save this here, and then we tried to, notice how this is just hanging here? Now it's interesting, we're not actually getting an error on that, but we're having trouble because we're trying to do some things with Mongoose, but we haven't actually connected. Okay, so there's an issue there. So all we really need to do to fix that is to just require this file, right? So let's say require, and again, from where we are, we're going to go into server, into config, and then mongoose. Okay, now let's try that again and make sure that it's working. Okay, we're good to go there. So what else do we want to do inside the mongoose file? Have any of you guys done the modularization yet? Yeah, we actually want to bring in, or basically require our models, right? Okay. So what we're going to do inside this file, we're going to require our different models, and then obviously we can take that logic back out of the server, right? We were just kind of doing that temporarily so that we didn't break anything. All right. So one way that I can require my models, because I know that I only have one in this specific project, is I can just require that specific file. So I can say, here we're inside config. I want to go out one level and then into my models folder. And then I want to grab Dojo, right? And then before, so here inside of our server, we no longer need to require Dojo. So I can just get rid of that. Okay, no breakage yet. We're okay. There is a different way of requiring our models, which I'll show you guys. So what about the situation when where I have multiple models? So it's not just Dojo, but I have ninjas and some other things. And what if I want to do something so that I don't forget to keep requiring all the new models that I create? Yeah, exactly. So that's basically what we're going to do is we're going to read that directory and then go through and find any file that has a .js ending on it. Let's just require that file. Okay? So let's show how that works. So for this, what we want to do is we want to import, or we want to require the fs module for file system. And then I'm going to comment this guy out here, and we're going to do fs.readFileSync. You guys remember what the sync is saying or doing here? Yeah, it's making it a synchronous operation. Okay, so it means that I don't have to basically wait for this to happen. I can run my code immediately. Okay, so let's say what we want the path to be. So the current path that we're on, or that we're in, is going to be our dir name, right? And then I want to go up one level into my models folder. Whoops. Models. Okay. And so what that's going to give me is that's going to give me an array of files, assuming that I have some files inside my models directory. And what I can do is I can then iterate through all the files that I found and then just check, is that a JS file? If it is, then I want to require, because it's going to be one of my models. Right? So we're going to use a function called forEach. And this is just going to allow me to touch every one of those files that we got back. Okay? forEach takes a callback function. And that callback function would take a file in this case. Now keep in mind that you guys can name this whatever makes the most sense to you. I'm just going to call it file. You could call it something else if you wanted. And then I'm just going to ask if file.indexOf.js is greater than -1. So that means, do I have a .js in my string? Because if I didn't, it would return -1. Then I want to require the file at that point. So we'll say require. Actually, I'm going to save this to a variable up here. So we'll say const models path equals this right here. And then I could just put this in here. So models path. And then when I found a file that has the .js in it, then I'm just going to require models path and then I'm going to add on to that a / and then the file itself. Okay. Whoops. What did we break here? Config. Oh, did I need a / there? How about that? What's happening here?
What happens if you just console log the file? Does it give you the full path?
Mongoose server config mongoose. If I just console log it in here, you mean?
Yeah. Like what's the?
Oh, you mean if I console log models path up here, like that?
I meant the file there. Is it giving you the full path of the file? So when you do models path plus file, is it redundant?
Path. Like this, like we were doing. Hang on one sec. Let's see. Oops. Oh gosh. No, I see what it is. This is actually the wrong thing. Sorry about that. It should not be read file sync because we're actually reading a directory, right? So that was that was completely wrong. It should actually be read dir sync. My bad. So yeah, that's what it's telling us down here. Illegal operation on a directory because we were trying to read a file, but it's actually a directory, right? Okay. So let's get rid of this. Change this to read dir sync. Okay. All right, now we're okay. And again, we can keep loading this guy up to make sure that it's working. All right. So that's good. So the other thing that we want to do is create our routes file because that's something that we want to bring out of the server.js as well. Now, let me just grab my routes for now. And then inside here, what we're going to do is we're going to export something. Here's how we do it. So if we want to export one object from this file, we can do this thing called module.exports. All right, and that's how we're basically going to give something back to whatever file is requiring it. So let's do this. We'll say module.exports. And this module.exports can actually be whatever we want it to be. It could be an object, it could be a string, it could be a number, whatever. It could also be a function. And this is going to look a little strange at first, but what we're going to do is we're just going to export a function from this file. And the function is going to allow us to attach all these routes to our application. Okay? So we're going to create a function that takes in an application, and then inside that function, I'm basically going to do this right here. I'm just going to apply my routes. Any questions about this before we move on? So let me ask you this. When I require this from some other file, what am I going to have to do to use it?
Okay, module export.
Say that again?
You're gonna have to import module export.
No.
Invoke it.
I'm going to require the file. That's what's going to actually be. Yes. As Alan said, we need to actually invoke this because this is a function that I'm exporting. Does that make sense? Because otherwise I'm just going to get back this function, but I have to actually use it in order to connect whatever the application is to these different routes, right? Okay. There's one other thing that's, or one other piece that's kind of missing from this, at least for now, which is this. Do we have a reference inside this file to Dojo? We do?
You have it in the server.
I have it in the server, right, but I don't have it here, right? So if I actually wanted to use Dojo in here, what would I need to do? So I would need to require Mongoose, right? And then to get Dojo, I do, whoops, mongoose.model, which gives me back the reference to that specific model, Dojo, right? Okay, now in order for us to require this, we'll go back to the server. And rather than these guys here, and we don't need this anymore, right? We're going to require our routes file. Okay, and that's inside server /config/routes. And what's that going to return us again? A function. So can I invoke this immediately if I want?
Yeah.
I can, right? Yeah, I can just invoke it right out the gate. Or we can do it in 2 steps. I'll show it in both ways for you guys. So if I invoke it right away, I can just pass in the application like that. Okay, and again, we shouldn't have anything breaking in the app. Still working. Or if you want to get a little bit more explicit, we could also set something. So we could say const routes equals requiring this, and then I could just invoke routes against the application. So any questions about this part? We're just requiring in the routes, and again, the routes is a function, and then we're immediately going to invoke that function against our application. All right, so that's cool. I'm going to turn it back to how we had it before, like that there. So our server file, as you can see, has already gotten nice and thin. Do we need this mongoose anymore? It's not being used in here, so we can safely take that out. All right. And I'll remove this too. Okay, so that server file is looking quite good. Now let's look at our routes file. Do we want to have all of this actual logic inside the routes? Or do we want the routes to just basically be, when I hit this path, I want to do this thing. When I hit this path, I want to do this logic.
Kind of like Django.
Exactly, yeah. So in Django, we had our urls.py file, right, where we had all these different URL patterns, and then we would just say views.whatever the function name that we're handling that was. So that'll make it very nice, because up in here, rather than doing all this logic, we can just require the controllers that we need, and then just use them in our different routes. Okay. So we don't yet have any controllers. Let's go ahead and create one. And we'll call it Dojos. All right. And then inside my controller, what do you think I'm going to, again, we're going to export something, right? What do you guys think we might export from this one, from the controller? A function?
Object.
Object would be better, right? Because we're going to have multiple functions here, right? Okay, so let's do module.exports. And then we're going to make a whole object here. And then I'm just going to have my different routes. So here inside routes, we have this little function here. So I'm going to grab this. This was basically our create dojo function, right? So let me just cut that out, and then inside dojos, we're going to create this method. We'll call it. We'll just call it create. Let me change the syntax of that right there. Okay, and then I'm going to have a second property for my index method. Again, that will take in a request and response.
Sorry, create is the key there.
Yeah, correct. So if I take this over here, let's just take, oops, I'm going to grab all this from right here, cut that, and then inside here, got to open that up. Oops. Okay. So again, I don't really need the request and the index route because I'm just going to grab all my dojos no matter what. The request doesn't give me any extra information that I need right now, so I'll just do that as an underscore. Okay, so that's good. So then in here, rather than specifying these functions as we were talking about, what are we gonna put in here?
Require it.
Yeah, so we need to require our dojo's controller first off, and then I'll get rid of this right there. So we'll say dojo's controller equals require, and then where the controllers are, again, are going to be one level up inside the controllers file, and then we have dojos, right? Okay, so how am I going to reference the create method here?
Find the key create. Find the key.
Okay, so but I mean, what's the syntax gonna look like? What am I gonna type in here? Dojo's controller dot create. Exactly right. Dojo's controller dot create. Okay. And then down here for the index route, what am I going to put in there? Dot index, right? Okay. So we're almost there, but back here inside the dojo's controller, I'm still kind of missing something, right? So I'm trying to reference this dojo model. Do I have it yet in this file? Not yet, right? Because I haven't brought in mongoose and I haven't grabbed a reference to it. So let's do that. So we'll say const mongoose equals require mongoose, and then const dojo equals mongoose dot model dojo. Okay, now inside the routes, let's go ahead and save this and see if we have any errors. No errors, right? Still good. And then one thing I wanted to point out too, and this is not necessary for you guys, but I just want you to know that you could do it. So mongoose, when I require it, is there a way that I could do these two things in one line of code?
Is mongoose already required in that model file?
You mean in here?
Yeah.
Yeah, we required it there. So here, but here inside the controllers, could I just do this in one line of code? No, we don't need any commas. So what I could do is I could just say dojo equals require mongoose, and then just immediately grab a reference to the model, right? I could chain off that because the require of mongoose will give me the reference to mongoose, and then I could just invoke the model method on that. Okay. So again, not strictly necessary. I just wanted to show you guys that you could do that. Okay, there we go. So we're back where we are. Have we covered all the modularization here? Or was there anything else that needs to be broken out? So we've got our model, right? We've got our controllers, we've got our routes, we've got our mongoose, and our views and our static. Anything else that we missed here? Did we do everything? I'm asking myself, and I'm also asking you. Did you guys see anything that we didn't do? No? Yes.
So at this point, we are creating our schema in the model file and also register the model in the model file. But then we are actually creating the reference of that model in the controller file, right?
No, we're not creating a reference to it. We're getting a reference to it.
Right, but is
So whenever you invoke the dot model function, that either takes one argument or two. When it takes two arguments, then we're actually creating that model. We're registering it with Mongoose. But when we only give it one argument, we're just getting a reference back to that model,
right?
to the one that's already been registered.
But because that mongoose.js file is required before the routes, is it possible to just like build that reference inside of the model file instead of doing it in the controller?
Well, how is the let me ask you this though: if we don't get a reference to it inside the controller, how would we be able to do anything like dojo.find or dojo.create?
Because isn't the controller like running after the mongoose.js? So by that point, there's already reference.
I see what you're asking. Yeah, but the key is that each file is going to need to have reference to that variable before you can start using it. So in other words, when I require my this controller right there, that controller has to have a reference to Dojo. Just because some previous file in my string of files has access to Dojo, that doesn't mean that my controller does at this point. I have to explicitly give it reference to that model.
Does that mean when we require something, it first read the file first and then combine it to the file where we require it?
Yes,
Okay.
that's correct. Yeah, when we require it, it's obviously going to run the code in that file that we're requiring.
Is it? Could you like theoretically, because when you require something, it gets put into a variable. Could you pass that variable to a function, like
Yeah.
the module itself?
Yeah. Yeah, because what if the module was just exporting a number or a string or something like that, or even a function? Because functions are first-class citizens in JavaScript. We can easily use it as an argument for something else, definitely.
Okay.
Yeah. And one other point that Alan brought up that I think maybe we should address is the order in which we require these things. So let's just explore something real quickly. If we actually, inside of our server here, what would happen if I tried to switch the order of these two guys? If you guys had to guess, what kinds of problems might this create? So yeah, because our models are actually being registered inside here. If I start trying to use them up here, well, they haven't been registered yet. So we're gonna have problems there, right? So if we actually try to say mongoose.model and get the Dojo model, it's not even available to us here. So we would expect some kind of breakage, right? And indeed, down here, schema hasn't been registered for model Dojo. Does that make sense to you guys? Sort of? So this is one of those situations in which the order in which we require things is quite important, because this is doing all the logic that's actually, it's registering those models for us. So if we try to use them first, we can't do that, right? They're not registered yet. Yes?
This might be a really dumb question, but like, are we supposed to modularize it as like when we start the project, or
No, that's not a dumb question.
like when do we modularize it? Because it's not worth it. Just do it at the end. What's the point of that? Like,
Yeah.
but it's hard to do it before you have a good base of things, you know.
Right. Well, and that's why it's always a good idea to sort of jot down in your mind or sort of have a game plan. How am I going to build this thing before you start coding, right? So yeah, I think if you were to modularize as you go rather than try to do it at the end, that makes the most sense. It's not to say that everyone would want to do it that way. Maybe you find that it's better to just do it at the end, but it seems like you'd be doing extra work, right? Whereas if you just kind of put these things where you know they belong as you're building it out,
And it's like if you do it at the
then you don't
end,
have to think about it.
if you do it at the end and you're, let's say this is for like the exam,
Mhm.
it's not like it's gonna change. I don't know. You finish it, then you submit your thing. Like it doesn't matter if it's modularized or not if it works. You know. So what's the point
And
if you're in
doing
a
it,
time crunch?
doing it at the beginning is also gonna help prepare you for the Java
Yeah.
stack because I mean all the modularization is done at the beginning there too in Java for the Spring Boot stuff.
That's a good point.
Instead of all your
Yeah.
folders and you kind of tweak
So
it
there's
as you
just
go.
like there's like a kind of a fine line because having all your stuff in your server file can help you. Yeah, I mean if it's not too crowded, you know, it can help you kind of understand what's going on.
Yeah.
That's like the same idea as when we went from like Flask to Django. So like Django like all has everything separated already.
Yeah, it just kind of helps you as you go. And being able to look at the folder system, I found it's a lot easier to understand it.
Right.
And if you're staring at, especially as it gets more crowded, that server file, if it just gets bigger and bigger and bigger as you're building a bigger project, looking at that is hard. Whereas you can just like open, okay, let me look at my models, and you'll have.
No, I know. I get the point of it. I guess it's just like with Django, for me, it made a little more sense why we're starting at the beginning with it because it's like so structured.
I think
as
it's
opposed
just-
to this.
It's just because it was already done for us. But this
Yeah,
one we just have to
exactly.
do it.
Yeah, that's why it made sense.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, so this is almost like a combination of what we did in Flask and what we did in Django. It's sort of similar to Flask in the sense that we're using this micro framework, Express, which doesn't have a strong opinion of about how we structure it. But then we're sort of leaning more in a Django direction by creating this modularization type of structure for it.
Does that mean we can do the same thing to Flask too?
Modularize it?
Yeah.
Yeah, sure. Absolutely. Yeah, in Flask, there's been some talk in the dojo recently. It's definitely can be quite powerful. So, I mean, sometimes people come away with the perception of like, oh, we threw away Flask, early on. Why did we even bother doing that? But it's a little bit more similar to Express in that it's a framework that you could plug other modules into, and you could make it into something very powerful. It's just that we were doing very simple things with it. Question?
That's also like kind of easy to experiment with, which
Right.
allows you to, I guess, just get something up and running really fast.
Right. Very, very good for prototyping.
Having to go through a big rigmarole of setting up a project, it's,
Sure. Yeah, there were a bunch of steps there. Okay. And a few of you guys didn't take the test in Jenga, so I guess you didn't really experience that yet. The fun of setting up the Django project. Someday. All right, no more questions. I'm going to stop the video, and we'll meet back up in the afternoon.